Hello and welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of Influential Minds, an EEI International Conversation series. My name is Alekia Malavarpu and I'm an analyst for international programs at EEI. Influential Minds is an evolution and rebrand of our virtual conversation series, which aims to discuss ideas that move the needle towards a more sustainable future with thought leaders from across the globe. For our inaugural session, EEI International Programs is honored to welcome Michael Spence, Nobel Prize winner and author of The Next Convergence, The Future of Economic Growth in a Multispeed World, to discuss economic shifts in light of evolving global challenges. He will be joined in conversation by our host, EEI Vice President of International Programs, Dr. Lawrence Jones. Throughout the session, please feel free to ask questions using the chat feature. Lawrence will aim to incorporate as many of them as possible into the conversation. Without further ado, I will turn this over to Lawrence to get started.
Thank you, Alekia. Good morning. Welcome, Michael. Nice to see you.
Good to see you, Lawrence.
Well, let me first of all begin by saying congratulations. After a decade or so since you received the Nobel Prize, it's certainly something that you deserve. But I want to jump into the book. And first of all, let me just show the book to the audience. This is the book we're going to be discussing, The Next Convergence, that Michael wrote about maybe more than a decade ago. And like I said to you, Michael, I bought this book as I was going through Stockholm a couple of years ago. And I read it then, and I'm reading it again. And I have to say that there are so many prescient questions you raised in the book, which we're going to get into in our conversation. We'll also talk with you a little bit about some of your recent articles that you've written for Project Syndicate, in which you've tried to lay out some very interesting ideas about where the world should be headed. But I want to begin first just to talk a little bit about the Nobel Prize. For those of us who haven't gotten it and may never get it, just tell us, what was life like before you got the prize, and what has life been since?
Well, before the prize, I had basically two lives, professional lives. One as what I think call applied microeconomic theorist, which is closely related to industrial organization. So we were trying to figure out really how markets work with realistic assumptions about, informational structure, who knows what, and so on. And I love that. And then after about 15 years of that, the president of Harvard asked me to be the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, which I thought was a fairly sudden change in direction. But anyway, I had a lot of fun, learned a lot about a whole lot of disciplines from my colleagues, and then moved over to Stanford University and became the dean of the business school. So that academic administrative period was basically about 15 years. So those are the two parts pre-Nobel, and I had stepped down in 1999 and was sort of minding my own business and sort of taking a look at we were in the middle of the internet bubble by that point, which was a kind of fascinating early, chapter in the digital transformation that we're experiencing. And then out of the blue, the Nobel Prize arrived. So
can you recall, where were you when you got that call? And what was your first reaction when you did hear that you were going to be getting a Nobel Prize?
I was in Hawaii, and I didn't get the call because they didn't know where I was. I was on sabbatical, and I'd had a bout with melanoma, so I was sort of recovering from that. But a friend of mine, they post these things soon after they make the calls, and a friend of mine at Stanford, was sort of up early in the morning. I mean, I think they do it in the afternoon in Sweden, but by the time you get to California, you're at 5 or 6 in the morning, and then if you go over to Hawaii in the fall, that's another 2 or 3 hours. So I was basically fast asleep when my friend phoned me, and I was stunned. I mean, I didn't see this coming at all.
Did you ever, in your wildest imagination, through your career, ever thought you would be getting that call?
Nope. I devoted zero thought to it. I mean, it wasn't as if I hadn't encountered these folks. One of my thesis advisors was the late Kenneth Arrow, who had received the prize early on in the life of the economics Nobel Prize. After me, actually, another thesis advisor, the late Tom Schelling, actually received the Nobel Prize. so, there were people around, but, with 15 years of academic administration, basically not doing economic research, I without even really thinking about it, I think I and others sort of counted me out. So I wasn't paying attention at all.
No. So you mentioned your two thesis advisor, and I'm sure throughout your career, since you got the prize, and even before, you've met several Nobel laureates, including obviously now yourself. So tell us, what are some of the things you all share in common in terms of mindset or even practical day-to-day activities from an academic standpoint? What's like in the mind of a Nobel laureate before he gets the prize?
Well, I think the vast majority of them aren't thinking about it at all. These are people who are just intensely curious, whatever their field, physics, biochemistry, etc. And they're sort of consumed with the work. I mean, my impression of most of them is that they don't even think of it as work. They just love to get up and go to the lab or whatever it is. So that's kind of what they have in common. Beyond that, they're a pretty diverse group. I mean, some are kind of bookish, and others do sort of ice dancing and as a hobby. I mean, they're all over the place. But I think they share that common characteristic, and I don't think most of them were sort of did anything in their careers that was designed to where it's very rare to find somebody who was aiming to receive a Nobel Prize, at least in my experience.
Yeah. So it's that intense curiosity. So anybody listening to this conversation with Michael needs to step up their curiosity to sort of be even close to getting something like a Nobel Prize. Let's get into the book. Given the current global economy, given the current challenges facing the world, now with your hindsight and obviously your foresight, if you were to write a sequel to this book, which I hope you do, by the way, would this title still be Next Convergence Part 2, or will it be something different, and why?
So I might keep the title and I might not, depending on, what editors think and publishers, but I would keep the concept of convergence. And I would certainly keep the multi-speed part. But that doesn't mean I'd write the same book. I mean, I think there's some really important new things. One of them is quite worrying, which is, there are various versions of this, but the lower income countries are facing a series of challenges and headwinds that are beyond normal. Pandemic, very severe climate shocks, induced migration, all that kind of thing. That kind of look like a perfect storm. So I would modify the convergence and say, I'd still pretty sure that a very wide range of emerging economies are going to make it. They may get slowed down in this environment for reasons that we'll probably talk about in a minute. But I do worry that the lower income countries, you can think of them as sort of late starters in the development process. I worry that they may not, that we'll start to see a pattern of divergence in that corner of the world, and there's a lot of people in it.
Okay, interesting. So if you think of where we are now and try to just take in consideration the geopolitics, the pandemic, and all of the above, do you see more convergence, or you think we're going to head into a sort of a more divergent world where you have more underdeveloped countries, more poverty compared to convergence where you see more growth?
So it's a kind of mixed picture, so let's take, major economies that appear to be succeeding, other than the ones that have already made the journey. So we know that Japan and Singapore and South Korea are now high income countries. And the Taiwanese economy, however you kind of describe that in relation to China, is similarly positioned. But I don't really have much doubt, in spite of the fact that there's major challenges facing virtually every economy, that China and India will make this journey. That's a fairly large number of people, which makes this journey means they'll sustain higher growth rates than the developed countries, and eventually they'll be wherever we are, as part of the kind of OECD club. And there's a number of others that you can be reasonably confident about, basically because they have the resources and the capability to get it done and the understanding of how you have to do it. But then again, I think that there's a subset of lower income countries. I was still pretty confident and optimistic about them because there's, for example, in lots of African countries, there's really talented young leaders. I think it's safe to bet on them and their capabilities. But when you overlay a pandemic, terrible problems with vaccine access, climate shocks, demographics that are really, really difficult with fertility rates, up in the neighborhood of 5 or more. And you start to sort of wonder whether they can sort of get into a pattern of sustained growth and generating employment, which supports it. So that when I worry about, who's going to sort of pay a high price for this, tough environment that we're in now, that's where I would focus.
You talk about economic growth, and really you do a very excellent job, I think, in the book in talking about growth. Two questions. First of all, just for the audience, where does growth come from? Because for many people, it seems to be a very nebulous, very complicated terminology. So where does growth come from? And after you address that, maybe then, do we need a new framework for growth based on what the world is, where we are today?
So on the second point, you certainly have to adapt. So let me try to answer the first question. I think it'll help with the second one, or the second part. Growth comes from the kind of sustained high growth that's sort of life changing for people in a country. Comes from, at one level, structural change. This isn't sort of the same economy, every 10 years when you take a snapshot of it. It's urbanizing. It has a big export sector. It's importing technology. It's educating people at a fairly high rate. The economy is transforming itself. And so in order to understand growth and growth patterns, you really need to understand the structural transformation. And the best description of that, at least for the early stages of growth, came from Sir W. Arthur Lewis, a Nobel Prize winner in the 60s or 70s, who basically laid out the model. He basically said, when you have an early stage developing country that hasn't started this process, most of the people are in traditional sectors, especially agriculture, and the growth model, kicks into high gear when it connects to the global economy, and people start moving to cities and producing goods which are sold into the global economy and bringing technology into the economy that makes it more productive, and so on. So there's a lot of ways to describe it. Productivity skyrockets as people move, to more productive sectors and so on. And then there's a bunch of supporting things. You need pretty high levels of investment to support sustained high growth. But that's kind of the process. There comes a time, it's called the middle income transition, when the growth model actually changes. You run out of people you can extract from the traditional sectors and find employment that's rewarding and gives them opportunity and higher incomes. And then you basically start to make a transition that where the growth model looks a little bit more like the growth model we're familiar with in developed economies. So you're investing heavily in human capital, you're moving up global supply chains, you have a much bigger domestic economy, right? So you're producing more goods and services for your own economy as opposed to for the global economy. And that transition is a difficult one as well. Lots of countries get caught and experience a bad growth slowdown at that point. But that's the idea. And once you get the hang of it, that this is really a complex kind of structural transformation, then basically navigating almost any set of changes, including the digital transformation that we're in, is more of the same. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's the same idea, which is people have to do different things. They need education and support. Then you need investment levels. Ditto the energy transition, right? I mean, you and I will talk about that. I probably in the not too distant future, but basically, That's an enormously big transition, and it requires massive levels of investment globally to make it possible. Now, whether we're going to do it or not is a different question.
Yeah, we'll get back to that because, in addition to growth, you also talk about innovation. And in fact, you talk about the role of innovation and growth. So let's talk about that. And in the context of the developing countries, how do we spur innovation in the developing world that will then lead to growth? How do we do that?
Well, so if you go back to the kind of, the W. Arthur Lewis model, he described the domestic part of that, incredibly well. There's a key feature of it that he understood well, but didn't emphasize, which is the global economy gives you two things when you're embarking on this, sustained growth process. One of them is essentially technology. The period when developing countries really experience sustained growth is the post-war period, post-World War II. Before that, you had 200 years of divergence, essentially from the British Industrial Revolution until the end of World War II, in which what we now call developed countries, sort of clambered their way up the technological and scientific and other ladders, but for a variety of reasons, especially colonialism, that didn't spill over, into the developing world. And that pattern changed completely in the post-war period. And that those spillovers started to happen at a relatively high rate. So innovation in the early stages of growth is adaptation. And then you see this continuous change as countries, become more capable, both in terms of human capital and the institutions that support innovation. And then they start innovating themselves, and so the so-called catch-up effect fades, but the innovation, the domestic innovation, takes over. So the early stages of innovation they're real, but they're more like adapting things that came from this period of divergence to the specifics of that economy. And then as you move up, you take China. China was basically 40 years ago when they started this high growth process, was essentially bringing technology in via multinational enterprises, setting up shop and so on. Now it's an innovative powerhouse because they've invested enormous amounts of their resources in people and institutions that support innovative activity. I mean, there's more to it than that. You don't get innovative ecosystems everywhere. So that's a subject that we may want to pursue later on. There is a kind of global explosion of entrepreneurial activity, which is one of the things that I find fascinating. And it's really in the last 10 years.
So crises seem to spur innovation because of the challenges that it onset.
Yep.
We now face in three crises. We have the pandemic, we have the war in Ukraine, and obviously we have the climate crisis. How hopeful are you that innovation will help get us out of these crises?
So to answer that, I think you have to have a time horizon. So I think in the short run, we just have to face the fact that these shocks are big enough, supply chain blockages, inflation, central banks in a tough position, et cetera. Trying to get out of the pandemic in some parts of the world, including China, which affects almost everybody else. We're going to have a period of slow growth, and some places are going to have a recession. I mean, they're not forecasting it formally, but I think we'll have a recession in Europe as a result of having to make this fairly rapid energy transition, diversifying away from dependence on Russian oil and gas. I hope I'm wrong, but it's certainly going to be a growth slowdown, and it'll be everywhere. And the only question is the magnitude, right? So I think the United States slowdown will be a little bit less, but we're not immune to this. And energy prices, as you know better than I, are still set globally, right? So and priced in dollars. So the short run is, there isn't any way to get out of this, right? I mean, that's just the way it is. Longer term, I'm much more optimistic. I mean, I have hopes for the energy transition, but the digital transformation virtually every economy that's underway has the potential to produce just an enormous productivity surge. Now, whether it will come to pass is an open question. I mean, I don't have, a better crystal ball than anybody else, but I think the potential is certainly there. And if we, take advantage of it, then, rising potential productivity is the single most important enabler of growth. And when you live in a world, with aging populations in 75+% of the global economy, measured in terms of GDP, not numbers of people. You've got these supply chain problems. You've got higher interest rates. You've got big market resets. You've got what's left over from the pandemic, and then a huge array of climate shocks, which I'll argue in a minute is going to give rise to a kind of global pattern of diversifying supply and demand chains. In that world, if you asked, what's the single most important thing that we could have, that would make things better, if not perfect, it would be a surge in productivity. And that would be a reversal of the recent trends. We've had about a 15-year pattern of declining productivity growth.
So if we do get that surge in productivity, and as you've mentioned, growth is key here, I want to just pivot a little bit to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and other goals being set by governments for climate goals. How critical is growth to achieving those goals? And if we have slow growth, is there a risk that those goals are not accomplished?
Yeah, so this is complicated because it again depends on who you're talking to, which part of the world you're talking about. So to go back to the early stage developing countries, where a significant priority is simply poverty reduction, right, or raising incomes. For that you just need growth, right? And when I sort of teach about this subject, I say, and I mean it. It's not because that's the thing that most people care about. I mean, people care about productive employment, contributing to society, the opportunity to be productive and creative. They desperately care about the opportunities for their children and grandchildren, their education, and a whole lot of things. The point is that sustainably improving all of those things, healthcare is another, or just health, sustainably making progress on all of those things absolutely requires that the incomes rise. You just don't have the resources to do it. Now, when you get to higher income countries, it's a different story. Right? Then I think, you really need this multidimensional assessment of welfare. And if you focus too much on growth, you're missing a great deal of the picture, right? So one way to think of it is, in the early stages of growth with relatively low incomes, growth is a necessary condition for achieving a broad set of things that people really care about. Once you get past that point, then you got to start paying attention to what those things are and how you're going to sort of make progress on those various fronts. And I think it's now widely accepted that you need a multidimensional framework for assessing economic and social progress, for sure. Now, where people differ, Lawrence, is whether you should aggregate that into one number to get people's attention. So throw growth out and have another index, overall performance. I mean, some people think that's very important. I prefer the multidimensional one, but there's no right answer on this.
I like the segue into metrics, because obviously, given your Nobel Prize and some of the work you've done, metrics is key. So if we were to sort of just think of a different framework, what would be some of the elements of a new growth framework, so that especially in developed economies, we are not sort of exercising ourselves over GDP? What would be some of the other elements that we should think about in the context of growth for the more developed economies?
Well, growth tells you virtually nothing about sustainability. For sustainability, you have to have, if you think of an economy growing, basically what is underlying that growth, sitting down in the foundation, is a bunch of assets, right? Not just bridges and roads and airports and ports, but human capital, institutions, etc. But intangible assets, if you like. And if you try to grow without building in parallel that foundation, then you can't keep growing. That sustainable growth really means that there's a balance between what's going on, year to year in the economy and the investments that create this foundation that enable it to continue. And now we face the fact that, and growth simply, growth in the sense of year to year changes in essentially incomes and output doesn't tell you anything about whether you're driving toward a brick wall or not. And we are. So in the climate area and a number of other areas, if you want to pay attention to the durability of the growth patterns that you're in, then you need broader measures. In this case, in the case of climate, there are now serious efforts to measure essentially the environmental capital, or sometimes called natural capital. Are we running that down to the point where we basically can't sustain our economies? Some people put this in different ways. Are we operating outside the planetary boundaries? Is another way to say it. So that's a simple dimension in which the conventional national income accounting just doesn't say anything at all. Ditto distributional issues. So if you have a rising pattern of inequality, you can measure that and you can worry about it and you can have policies that deal with it. But if you stare at aggregate growth numbers, you won't see it, right? So you need, most people in some form or other care about whether there's a reasonable degree of equity. They might not agree on what exactly that is, within a society or across societies, but nevertheless, if you want to pay attention to what's going on, you have to measure it, and then you can argue about it after you measure it. But if you don't measure it, I think one of the things that happened in the United States is it wasn't that we didn't measure these things, but basically we didn't pay enough attention to them, and so we have pretty serious pattern of rising income and wealth inequality, and are kind of boxed into a corner, where we have to sort of try to figure out how we're going to get out of this. And of course, rising inequality gives rise to, or certainly contributes to, sort of political and social polarization. If you have haves and have-nots. There are various versions of this. Globalization, was run without attention to its distributional consequences, etc. And there's lots of events that have adverse distributional consequences. Then there's health, and education and a whole lot of other things that I would say, there is not anything like a perfect correlation between economic performance as conventionally measured and performance in the healthcare area. And the United States is a good example. There's lots of countries that have lower growth rates that are still in the high income category that have superior health outcomes in a number of dimensions. So I think by this time people recognize that we got to pay attention to those things, and then if we're falling short on one of them, we have to devote time, attention, creativity, and resources to dealing with it.
So who do you think is best positioned then to prepare the public for dealing with the world where we have slow growth, but we may still have an improvement in some of the other things you've mentioned? Is that the role of the economists like yourself, or is it the role of the media, politicians? Who should tell the story for citizens to understand, especially in democratic societies, but more broadly, that we're in a new world? It's not about just GDP, it's about GDP plus all these other issues that we need to think about. Who tells that story?
Well, I certainly wouldn't exempt, my profession. I don't think we're alone, but we certainly need to contribute to it. And the work of a wide range of very talented people, Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, etc., have made significant progress on that, so that massive amounts of data are available, and we can understand these patterns in the short and the long term. I think the media bears responsibility for this in reporting on essentially societal conditions, both challenges and achievements, and I think to some extent they discharge that responsibility. In the climate area, you've got a cast of literally millions who are now engaged in. So I think the long battle in climate change was to go from a relatively small group of people who knew this was a serious problem like say 25 years ago, to a world now in which the vast majority of people know there's some kind of problem, and you do your best you can. But I mean, honestly, I think the progress in taking the climate and sustainability challenge seriously is in part attributable to the evident increase in the frequency and severity of extreme climate events.
Yeah, and I think the point you made about whose role it is, whose responsibility is an important one. I want to then tell the audience, if you have any questions for Michael, please go ahead and type it in the chat. We'll get to as many as possible. Before we move on to what should be an exciting activity here for the first time ever, Michael, we're going to be doing a wheel of books, if you may, and we're going to spin a wheel, and we're going to give out 3 of your books to the lucky winners. So I'm going to ask Elikia on my team to go ahead and spin the wheel, and we'll pick 3 winners of a copy of Michael's book, The Next Convergence. Elikia?
Oh my goodness. That's clever.
Okay, so registrant number 54, you are a winner. You will receive an email from us and a copy of Michael's book. 2 more books. Spin the wheel. Registrant number 134, you're the next winner. You get a copy of Michael's book, and the last winner will be?
What will you do if it comes up, with 54 again? Chances are low.
Low. Thank you so much. Winners 18. Number 18 will also receive a copy of Michael's book. Thanks for indulging with us this little activity to get the audience engaged. All right, let's keep moving on then. So I want to now, Michael, talk a little bit about development economy. You spent a lot of time on that, and growth in the context of developing countries who are resource rich. A lot of them, right, but they're still not developing fast enough. Right. What do we do now? I mean, we've been talking about this for the last 3 decades, but yet we see the so-called resource curse. So my question is, as we now face a new resource boom in terms of lithium and cobalt and all of these critical minerals for the energy transition, how should developing countries with those resources act differently so that they can actually see growth more broadly in their countries?
So, I mean, I think that, some adaptation of policies for those who are doing it well is required. If you anticipate an energy transition in which even if it takes decades over time, the relative prices of, fossil fuels and other things starts to shift. You probably want to adapt your policies, but at a more fundamental level, I mean, I think the ingredients in effective, management of natural resources with the goal of achieving, growth and development is first good governance, right? It's absolutely crucial. If you have a group of people, and I'm not talking about, the form of governance, I'm not talking about whether it's a democracy or a single party system or whatever, but whoever's there, if they're systematically trying to pursue an agenda, which is kind of the long-term public interest, then you've rounded the single most important corner. But that's just not true everywhere. I mean, there's too many examples, of different agendas, ranging from theft to fraud to, promoting the interests of a subset of people in the population, however their relationship to the governing group is defined. Now, I was very struck, by some of the examples that came from an earlier era, and it seems pretty clear that this kind of, what the objective function is really matters. Then there's competence. Basically, natural resources relaxes a constraint that should be used primarily to produce investments that are supportive of growth. And that's not, I mean, when you get into the technicalities, there are institutions that are, trying to do this and help countries do it, like the Natural Resource Governance Institute, for example, that came from a merger of Revenue Watch and the Natural Resource Charter that Paul Collier and colleagues started. I think they're doing very good work. It's not easy, but I think there's a group of leaders in natural resource countries that are pretty determined to improve the management. But when you think about, the supply chain associated with this, so you have natural resources, you have to do a good job of auctioning the rights to exploit them, right? Mm-hmm. Then you have to divide the revenues up and tax them in the appropriate way. And then you have to invest, it's easy to say, you got to invest the proceeds in a portfolio of assets, tangible and intangible assets that support growth. And then you ask yourself the question, does everybody know how to do that, right? From the get-go? That's the answer is, that's something that is part of the learning process.
Yeah.
And then if you have a pile of, the last thing is if you have a pile of, if you have way too much income, you don't want to sort of spend it now. You've got to put it in a sovereign wealth fund, and treat it as a resource for the future. So embedded in all that is a whole lot of capabilities that I think we could do a better job helping countries, skills, capabilities that they can acquire. The other thing is I think the other set of initiatives are directed at the multinationals in the natural resource area. So transparency, and adhering to certain standards and not participating in dysfunctional activity in pursuit of profit is a pretty important part of the puzzle as well.
A lot of questions coming in, Michael. I'm not surprised. So let's take one here from Neil. So Neil's question is, many believe that the invisible hand of the free market best manages economic growth. Can this or does this apply to other measures you have mentioned?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it depends on how you interpret it. So all of the successful, sustained growth cases that I've ever seen, and when we did the Growth Commission work, we found there were 13 economies that had sustained growth at or in excess of 7% a year for 25 years or more. That is transformational, right? Because at 7% a year, you're doubling every decade, right? So that's a definition of sustained and very high growth. All of those cases have slightly different but varying versions of an activist, pragmatic public sector, government, and a private sector that is also innovative and incentivized and active. And so writing the government out of the script is a bad idea, and writing the private sector out of the script is also a bad idea. And somewhere in the middle, there's no right answer. There's a balance. And the reason this is true is the private sector can't do certain crucial things. They don't create public goods at a fast enough rate. They don't invest in certain things at a high enough rate because the private benefits are exceeded by the collective or social benefits of those investments. So at least the way I think about the world, the model that you want is an effective, competent state. You don't want it crowding out the private sector. And if you look at examples all over the world, I think you'll find this pattern is basically characteristic. And you will also find, when you fall too far toward the extremes, then you start to see problems developing.
So here's
a very good question.
Yeah, here's a question from Rob Edwards, who was a former student of Stanford. And basically, Rob is asking, do you believe that business school curriculums are now better or sufficiently aligned with societal goals and equity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think they're definitely better than they were. I also think, business schools are evolving, as they should, in response to sort of business challenges and needs. And, so in the United States, as far as I can tell, we have, at least to some extent, and probably a great extent, decided that the shareholder value maximization model is not going to, it's not fit for purpose in this world. There are too many things that corporations need to do that amount to partnerships with the public sector to solve major social problems. And that you can see this in ESG or the discussions of purpose and so on. And all of those things, I think, are starting, maybe more than starting, to be reflected in business schools. You also have major programs in lots of business schools in social entrepreneurship. This is basically entrepreneurial ventures whose from the get-go, whose goal is to survive financially, but they measure performance not in terms of rate of return on capital, but impact on society. So yeah, I think that maybe we're not moving fast enough. Well, I'm out of that world now, but you can always criticize for not being up to speed quickly enough. But I think there's a major evolution underway.
We'll take two more questions from the audience. There's one here from Sandra Baer. Moving from governments and large institutions, can you recommend actions for individuals to truly influence the new balance societies face?
Well, I think actually we're starting to learn that individuals collectively, but not necessarily acting collectively, are very influential, because individuals are employees and they're consumers, right? And they're voters and so on. So they have multiple roles, all of which can be influential. And I think we're starting to see that this really matters. So there are numerous, stories, I think they're probably accurate, of people, choosing their, employment based on whether they feel on balance that their employer is operating in a way that's consistent with their own personal values. And if that divergence gets too extreme, I think people change their jobs. And similarly, consumers, I don't want to overstate this, because, when people have budgets, they'll buy things that are, as cheap as they can. And maybe they don't, sort of have a fully developed sort of social agenda when they go out and purchase things, but on balance, and I think you can see this in the climate change area, especially. I mean, people are really starting to ask the question, is it consistent for me to work with an entity that doesn't look like it's very well aligned with some longer term sustainability agenda, whether it's a fossil fuel company or what? Now, I don't think let me be clear. I mean, we are in a transition that's going to take decades. We cannot flip a switch and turn everything green. It's just not going to happen. So we need natural gas, to supplement, to take out parts of coal, maybe. We've got lots of transitions to manage. And so a balanced view of this doesn't mean, that anything that sounds like a fossil fuel is bad at all. And it doesn't mean that you can't work in that neighborhood. It means that, what matters is, what role your employer is taking. And these are just examples. So I think individuals are increasingly influential as they believe that their values need to be reflected in the choices they make in life.
So you mentioned transition. We are indeed undergoing a transition. And let's talk a little bit about some of the bumps we've had. So obviously the war in Ukraine has created a lot of bumps. We've seen a reversal maybe in policies in some countries, in Germany, for example, in terms of coal, and in other countries. How do you see these bumps sort of slowing down or accelerating the transition?
So I think in the short run, there might be a bit of a slowdown. I mean, on an emergency basis. It really depends on, how much of the inflow is cut off. So Germany, as I think everybody knows, made a decision many years ago to exit nuclear. They haven't completely done that, and they may kind of reverse part of that decision. That would be kind of neutral or positive. That we may have more uptake of coal as an emergency measure in the short run. But I think longer term, it's probably, on balance, positive. So for example, we have not successfully yet introduced a kind of global carbon tax or a global price on carbon. There are lots of initiatives in lots of different places: Europe, Asia, California, parts of the United States, etc. So I don't mean we haven't made any progress, but all of a sudden we have this great big increase in oil and gas prices, and coal for that matter. I checked. I thought maybe coal wasn't part of this, but it is. So that's going to change incentives. Now, what happens now depends on the policy responses. In the developing world, to go back to our earlier discussion, one of the things we discovered is that virtually, and this is 10 years ago, 10 or more years ago, this is changing. Virtually every developing country was subsidizing energy, which at the time meant fossil fuels. Or the production of, electricity using fossil fuels. That's terrible policy, right? From a long run growth point of view. I mean, even if you didn't see the climate change agenda coming at you, you build energy and efficient buildings that last 40 years, right? There's all kinds of stuff that goes wrong if the pricing goes wrong. So I think the countries that are facing these higher prices, and it's pretty much everybody, may need to do something to buffer the shock because it's happened very suddenly. But the wrong thing to do would be to sort of say, we're not going to allow these prices to pass through. One of the things that's been talked about for a long time, and we've never really done, is a kind of stabilization fund. Energy prices are pretty volatile. They get spikes every now and then because of supply and demand conditions or geopolitical conditions or whatever. So a reasonable policy would be, we'll knock off the peaks, right? But we'll also knock off the floors, right? Why would we knock off the floors? Because we want to incentivize investment in alternatives, right? And if every time, you sort of think you've got something to invest in, oil goes to $30 or less a barrel, it's not great from the point of view of the risk of that kind of investment. So there's a reasonable case to be made for, protecting consumers when there's spikes. And, the problem is we never did the bottom part of that, right? We never put a floor on. And now we want to put a ceiling on it, right? To protect people from this sudden change. And sort of my answer to that is, well, that's kind of half the right answer, but it's not a very good policy if you don't do both, right? So maybe we'll get there. I don't know. But the other thing I think is worthy of note, Lawrence, is, relative energy, not so much independence, but resilience is going to produce a diversification. It's for sure true in Europe. The Japanese already did it. When the war started in the Ukraine, I checked the Japanese, and all of their sourcing, oil, gas, and coal, is highly diversified, across countries, completely unlike Europe. And Europe understands, all the leadership in Europe understands that the dependence on Russia was a mistake, and they're going to diversify. Now, this is going to be painful in the short run, because a lot of the gas is coming in pipelines. Italy, where I am, is 45% dependent on Russian gas coming in on pipelines. Germany's higher than that. The liquefied natural gas isn't going to appear overnight. And when it does, it's going to be more expensive, both because of the technology, the transport and all that. And the demand for liquefied natural gas as part of the energy transition in Asia, and these are huge economies, right? Is going to go through the roof. So it may be really expensive in the longer term. But the green technologies are, you don't have to import sun and wind, right? So increasing your resilience with respect to energy is actually a positive force, or a positive incentive with respect to at least that aspect of the energy transition. So it's hard to know, but I think a reasonable guess when you sort of add this all up, I mean, we'll find out by living through it, but is short-term headwind, longer term, maybe even an accelerant.
Yeah, we have about 10 more minutes, Michael. I want to get into some of the other things you've written about more recently. The book is obviously focus on the multi-speed world, but then we have the multipolar world, the dipolar world. And specifically, I want you to talk a little bit about U.S.-China relationship. You've written a piece in Project Syndicate. You talk about the importance of this sort of a competition and collaboration. How important is the U.S.-China relationship for the world in tackling some of the big challenges we face? And how do you do what you talk about, compete but collaborate?
Well, it's more complicated, right? Then I suppose in a way we did that, but the asymmetries were so great that the competition wasn't much, of a factor, in the early stages, right? China was a labor-intensive, process-oriented, export-oriented economy, and we weren't. And they weren't terribly advanced in a technological sense, and they didn't have sort of non-economic sort of geopolitical aspirations, whatever they are, right? So this is certainly a more complicated environment. I mean, the simple answer to the question is how the relationship between China and the United States evolves is going to affect everybody, right? If it goes badly, you'll have spheres of influence, or what some people call elements of a new economic Cold War. There's a vast number of people in a vast number of countries who don't want the world to go that way. They say repeatedly, we do not want to choose up sides, sort yourselves out, so that we are operating in some version, a more complicated version, but some version of an open, multilaterally organized global economy. That's what they want, and that's what we should deliver. Now, on the relationship itself, I think, the level of trust between the two countries has fallen to the point that you can't escape the notion that there's going to be some kind of strategic competition. And that the article I think Lawrence was referring to is, I said, that's not all bad, provided the rules, are appropriate, right? We might even incentivize, accelerated progress in some areas if we're competing with each other, as opposed to, one of them so dominant that we're just sleeping at the switch. But the bad form of competition is not when you try to advance by investing, and magnifying whatever creative abilities and talents you have, but instead you try to cripple the other player, right? So in sports, you can win by running faster, but you can't win by sort of stamping on the toe of the other runner just before the race. In Schumpeterian competition, we have rules, right? The incumbents have certain kinds of ability to make life miserable for the new and potential entrants. And that's what competition policy and antitrust law is designed, however imperfectly, to prevent. So it's a real competition, and the people who win on the substance, right, on the new technology, the innovation, new products and services, win. And a version of that will actually work pretty well if the United States and China can agree to compete on that basis. And then finally, in terms of cooperation, again, we keep talking about climate change, but it's crucial. But on that one, we have to cooperate, all right? And including on the technology side. And my assessment is, if in that area, in the technologies we will need, probably we can make progress for the next 10 years with the technologies we have, but after that, we need new stuff. We need carbon capture, fusion if we can get it, a whole lot of things, as well as cost declines of the stuff we have. But that technology has to flow with essentially seamlessly, with no frictions all over the world, or we don't even have a chance of solving this problem. And so, and key players in that are the United States and China. We're not the only players for sure, but we're key players. And so in layers like that, we should just agree to suspend whatever strategic competition we have and act in a different way.
Michael, I've always wondered about we're going to a energy transition, multiple transitions, but I also see us going to a demographic transition, right? And so do you think, from a standpoint of trust, is there a way for the next generation of leaders to sort of adapt a more trusting approach to one another, meaning the Gen Zs of the world? Can we start working so that they do not replicate the lack of trust that is currently existing, but that they then define a new framework for agreeing to live and work together on this planet. Is that something we can work towards, rebuilding trust at the level of the Gen Zs and others, as opposed to those who are currently lacking trust towards one another?
Yeah, I think we can. You know, but the most important ingredient in that is contact, real contact, not Zoom contact, contact. You know, remember when Nixon, you know, went to China with Kissinger, and we decided to sort of open up. An important part of that diplomacy was it was called ping pong, diplomacy, right? It was designed to maximize the amount of, to the extent we could, interaction between people. And, you know, we still have, although it's declining and there are, you know, storm clouds on the horizon, we still have fairly large numbers of people, including, especially in the United States,
from all over the world. Sorry, that thing ran out of gas. Can you still hear me?
Yes, pretty good. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, we're now using the the computer's audio. So I think we have, you know, we have, and still very large numbers of Chinese students. You know, we have people from all over the world leading major corporations or doing important startups and whatnot. I think we can do more of it. So the bottom line is, Lawrence, I think if we pay attention, what you don't want is a situation in which people, you know, when people think about some other group of people, another country, they think about people who are sort of 5,000 miles away and I've never met one, right? That is not where we want to be. And I think this generalizes. I think you policies that are designed to produce this sort of, at least as a side benefit, this kind of interaction is important. And we still have some of the assets. I mean, I have friends all over China. You know, these are people I've worked with, worked beside, you know, at times kind of helped with policy, you know, development in the government and whatnot. Now, you know, we may get pushed back to our one side or the other because of the geopolitical tensions, and that would be a great shame, but they're still there, right? These are people who basically share the same, roughly the same vision about how the world should work in a kind of mutually supportive, cooperative way. So I'd be optimistic about that.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take 2 or 3 more questions, Michael, before we wrap up here. The first one I want to bring to you, and we'll try to get through them as quickly as we can. A lot of discussion around economies of scale and the need for that. And we also see a lot of big conglomerates being formed. A lot of the big tech companies, you see some people talking about the new form of monopolies. Right. How important, what is the role you see for the likes of the Apples, Googles, and others, and the Facebooks, and you name it, in terms of making sure that competition continues to be a foundation for innovation and a foundation for growth? What's the role of the big players in making sure that they do not cannibalize the rest of the market?
Right. So the mega platforms, which are essentially almost all located in the United States and China, that may surprise people, but it's true. I mean, there's, you know, Mercado Libre in Latin America is a pretty big e-commerce and payments platform, very, very successful. But it's in a slightly smaller market. So, you know, the Alibabas and Ant Financials and Googles and Amazons, you know, you don't find them in Europe, at least not, you know, domiciled here. They're enormously powerful. The ecosystems that they are the center of, that they architect, are enormously powerful, you know, engines for creating inclusive growth opportunities. But, you know, they're going to be regulated. So the world in which, you know, we lived 15 years ago was the internet's a wonderful thing, and it's, you know, there's a few standards associated with it. That's gone, right? It's going to be regulated everywhere, not the same way. And part of it is competition, and, you know, and so on, you know, and not using their market power to block access to markets or buy up everybody before they get to markets, so you don't have to compete with them. And that's to use American terminology, that's the job of antitrust. You know, and Congress is in the middle of this too. So, but there's other issues, you know, there's, you know, how do you regulate, if you want to regulate at all, internet content, you know, or do you want to rely on private sector in, you know, incentives for data security? or defining, what are the responsibilities related to sort of privacy and the use of data. Can you sell it to somebody, etc.? All of these things are kind of works in progress right now. And they're important and they're happening everywhere, right? So, you get on a plane and fly to Beijing and you'll discover there's probably, certainly in a very aggressive set of regulatory patterns. The same in fintech, right? With artificial intelligence, you can do a fantastic job of lending to people who traditional banks have trouble lending to because they don't know who they are. They're completely anonymous, right? No track record, no collateral, no nothing. But they do participate in the digital economy. And it turns out that the people who have the data, can lend money to them. But then the regulators come in and say, yeah, but now you're competing with banks, right? The banks have, capital requirements underpinning their lending activity, their credit activity, and you don't have any. That's not fair. We're not going to do that anymore. And besides, it's risky. And so, we're in this world of kind of moving targets all the way around. But, we'll get to the end of it eventually. And it'll be heavily regulated. There is a fairly serious risk of some degree of balkanization of the global economy as a result of this. I should tell you a story. When I used the word balkanization in a talk in Turkey, in Istanbul, a very nice participant, a woman, put her hand up and said, you might want to use a different term, at least in this part of the world. So I said, okay, I won't use fragmentation is a better term for what we're talking about. But we right now underway are numerous across a wide range of countries restrictions on the use of data, whether it can move across borders, whether it can be stored in any country other than the one for which the data is about, etc. And then you ask, so digital global supply chains with data that can't move across borders. We're in this world where we're going to have to try to figure out the answers and balance these things, but it's not simple.
Yeah,
I think that's where we are. The other thing I'll mention, real quick, Lawrence, is the mega platforms get all the attention, because that's the thing, when you pull out your phone and you use, that's kind of what you see. But there is literal explosion of entrepreneurial activity, much of it in the digital area globally. It's extraordinary. It's happened in the last 10 years. These are entities, they're not small. I mean, a lot of them are unicorns, meaning companies that get a valuation of $1 billion or more before they go public. So you have, I don't know, 300 and some odd in China, 500 in the United States, 100 in India and rising rapidly. Lots of them in Brazil. We even have them in Europe, in Paris and Berlin. So I think it's kind of invisible. When people focus on the mega platforms and think they dominate the digital world, they don't. They dominate part of it. But there's another part that's growing pretty fast. And some of them are going to come up and eventually threaten those folks. So it's pretty healthy down at that level, this globalization of entrepreneurial activity and the support of ecosystems.
There are a lot of things we didn't cover, Michael, and we could go on for more than a year just talking about some of these issues. I want us to end on two quick topics. One is institutions. I mean, you talk a lot in your book about the important role of institutions. We have the G7, G20, World Bank, a lot of other international organizations. How important are their roles? And also, do you imagine a situation where developing countries develop so much so that there is no longer the need for the World Bank? I've gotten that question many times. What happens when the developing countries and poverty is gone? Will we still need the World Bank?
Probably not. I mean, we're not there yet, but the World Bank started as a war recovery bank. Had nothing to do with the developing world or poverty reduction. And they finished that mandate. And then they adopted this one, which was, I think, entirely appropriate. And that's been with us for the last at least 50 years. And, it would be nice someday down the road if that weren't the main activity. What I expect to happen then is the World Bank will move to something else that's a challenge, maybe aggressively funding global public goods in the sustainability area and so on. But they've already done it once. They could do it again. These institutions are very important, Lawrence, and you and I talked briefly about it before, but the problem right now, they're in retreat, there's no question about that. It varies, but the WTO is struggling. Yeah, I think relative to the needs, some of them are undercapitalized. The IMF is still pretty influential, but we probably could use a larger IMF. But the underlying problem here is that the deciders in chief, to use George Bush's term, are nations, right? And if they are having trouble agreeing on anything, then the casualties will be in part these important international institutions. So the WTO has been a sideswipe not because they were incompetent, it's because a major player started ignoring them, and they had trouble reaching agreement on additional trade agreements. But the dispute resolution mechanism has been under attack too, because people sort of say, well, if I don't like the answer, then I'm ignoring it. And if you're big enough, you can get away with that. I mean, the G7 can probably get something done, but it's the developed countries, club. And the G20 is much more representative. But if you have China and Russia and the US and Europe, and a few other India and some Indonesia and some major developing countries in this environment with this level of tension, it's a little hard to see them sort of agreeing on much of substance, right? In the short run. I mean, Indonesia's got them on this round, so they're going to try. And we can always hope that they get somewhere and do what Lawrence said a minute ago, which is to say, okay, we're going to disagree about that, but let's focus on this where we might be able to agree. So I wouldn't write them off. And it's probably still a good idea for them to get together, but I wouldn't underestimate the challenge of engineering any kind of substantive, and reasonably aggressive, international collective action at this point.
Well, let's end on a note that you are good at, Michael, which is growth. And I want to talk very briefly about sustaining growth and minimizing inequality. Mm-hmm. So by the year 2030, 2050, or between the year 2030, 2050, the world population is set to grow to between 9 billion, about 9 billion people. We will still have 7 billion living in what we call the developing world, or maybe the emerging economies. And we'll have about 2 billion people living in the rich world, more or less. Now, how do we ensure that this transition is done in such a way that we can sustainably raise the level of standard of living for the 7 billion people, but still maintain some common level of sustainability or lifestyle for those who are already living in the rich world? In essence, can we do both? Can we find this balance without someone having to give? Because it seems for me that it's difficult to have everyone still be rich and other people getting rich as well. So how do we do this, sustain growth, minimize inequality at the same time?
It's a very good question. I mean, Lawrence, I don't think it's as hard as you suggest. So I did a few calculations. So if you take the major developing countries, they're developed countries, right? Europe's 450 million. The United States is 350 million. Canada adds, another 35. Japan's 120 million. You get up to about 1 billion. Maybe you could go around and find some more. If you add South Korea and the Taiwanese economy and Singapore, which only has 4 million people and stuff, you start to get up there. Then you've got the problem that you described. But, my best bet is that at least, well, let's take China and India. But each of them has a population of 1.4 billion. Okay. And so that's 2.8. All right. So you're already at almost 3 times the current, high income group. And unless something goes badly wrong, my expectation is these will be high income countries by the time China well before 2050 and India, following along, but probably in that category by 2050. And there's a bunch of other countries that are probably going to be in the same category. So what I'm trying to say is the problem may not be as hard as you think. If you have a world in which, let's say, somewhere around 60% of the world's population is living in high income countries, then their resources relative to the needs of the lower income countries are going to be absolutely massive, right? Now, that doesn't mean they'll discharge their responsibilities, but it means the balance, between the availability of resources and living well and the ability to invest, because it's in our mutual interest to do it. I mean, we don't want a whole continent floundering around, or they're desperately migrating or whatever. I'm not saying that's where the African countries are going to be. I'm a lot more optimistic than that. But I think what in your narrative, what's missing is this continuing high growth potential of major parts of the emerging economy, so that on your time horizon, they'll actually be in the OECD kind of territory.
Well, Michael, this has been wonderful. Again, congratulations on the Nobel Peace Prize after maybe a decade, but congratulations also on the book.
Not peace. I've never been criticized for.
Well, economics. I sometimes end up blending it all together. But really, it's been a fascinating conversation. The book is The Next Convergence. I highly recommend this book, even though it was written about more than a decade ago. It is still very substantive. And Michael, we look forward to your next book. Whenever it's written, I'll be one of the first to get it. And certainly would love to have you back on our series of Influential Minds. And thanks again for agreeing to be our inaugural guest on this very important platform. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a great pleasure, Lawrence. Thank you. Thank you for having me.